Blood is thicker than water, but greed is a venom that poisons both. Our family reunion was supposed to be a lavish celebration of wealth and legacy. Instead, it became the exact moment my public humiliation transformed into my father's devastating, irrecoverable downfall. The Harrington estate in Newport, Rhode Island, was a sprawling monument to old money and carefully curated secrets. It was a crisp Saturday evening in late November, and the annual family gathering was in full swing. 30 relatives ranging from wealthy, judgmental aunts to cousins who spent their trust funds faster than they could be replenished, milled about the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the mahogany paneling, illuminating the forced smiles and air-kissing that defined every Harrington event. Standing near the edge of the room, 17-year-old me wanted nothing more than to disappear. Dressed in a simple, understated black velvet dress that sharply contrasted with the glittering, ostentatious gowns of my relatives, I felt like a ghost haunting my own home. My father stood at the center of the room, holding court. He was a man who measured his worth by his public perception. Tall, imposing, and impeccably tailored in a charcoal Tom Ford suit. He laughed loudly at a joke told by his brother, Uncle David. Glued to my father's side was Brenda, my stepmother of 3 years. Brenda was a woman who wore her ambition as loudly as the staggering diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist. She possessed a calculated, icy charm that she weaponized against anyone she deemed beneath her, a category that primarily included me. I took a slow sip of my sparkling cider, my eyes scanning the room. I could feel the lingering stares of my family. Aunt Clara, draped in an excessive amount of fur despite the indoor heating, leaned over to whisper something to Cousin Leo, her eyes darting toward me. Ever since my biological mother passed away 5 years ago, I had become the black sheep. My mom had been the heart of the family, bringing warmth to the cold Harrington walls. Without her, I was left adrift in a sea of sharks. The tension of the evening began to physically manifest when Brenda suddenly pulled my father away from a conversation with the family's investment banker. Her manicured hand gripped his forearm tightly, her nails digging into the fabric of his suit. She whispered frantically into his ear, her face pale, her eyes wide with manufactured panic. My stomach dropped because I knew that, look, whenever Brenda feigned distress, the fallout invariably landed on my shoulders. My father's posture stiffened, his jaw locked, and his gaze immediately snapped across the crowded ballroom, landing squarely on me. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a storm of barely suppressed rage. He whispered something back to Brenda, who nodded vehemently, dabbing at the corner of her dry eye with a silk handkerchief. Without a word to his guests, my father marched across the marble floor, the crowd instinctively parting for him. When he reached me, he didn't raise his voice, but his tone was laced with an undeniable hostility. My study. Now, he ordered, his voice dangerously low. Dad, what's going on? I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the sudden tremor in my hands. Do not make a scene. Walk, he demanded. Reluctantly, I set my glass on a passing waiter's tray and followed him down the long, dimly lit corridor that led to the west wing of the estate. The heavy oak door of the study clicked shut behind us, sealing us in a room that smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and scotch. He rounded his massive oak desk and slammed his fist onto the polished wood, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Where is it? He demanded. I flinched. Where is what? Do not play dumb with me. You've always been rebellious. You've always resented Brenda, but I never took you for a common thief, he said. The accusation felt like a physical blow. A thief? What are you talking about? The Staffordshire sapphire, my father hissed, leaning over the desk. Brenda went to the master safe this evening to retrieve it for the family portrait. The safe was locked, undisturbed, but the velvet box was empty. She saw you coming out of our wing of the house earlier this afternoon. My heart pounded against my ribs. The Staffordshire sapphire was my mother's most prized possession, a flawless, deep blue gemstone passed down through her lineage. It was the one thing I was promised I would receive on my 18th birthday. I was in the West Wing because I was looking for the charger for my laptop, I pleaded, stepping forward. I didn't touch the safe. I don't even know the combination. Dad, you know how much that necklace means to me. Why would I steal something that is already supposed to be mine? Because you are impatient and spiteful. He snapped. Brenda told me you've been looking into pawnbrokers. She found a search history on the family iPad. That's a lie. My voice cracked. She's setting me up. She hates that the necklace belongs to Mom's side of the family and not hers. Enough, my father roared, his face flushed with anger. I will not tolerate you slandering your mother. She is not my mother. I yelled back, tears finally stinging the corners of my eyes. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room as my father straightened his posture, buttoning his suit jacket with a chilling calmness. You have humiliated me for the last time, he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute monotone. You think you can steal from this house? You think you can disrupt the peace of this family? We are going back out there, and you are going to face the consequences of your actions. Dad, please, you have to believe me. I didn't take it, I begged. Walk, he commanded, opening the study door. The lively chatter of the grand ballroom came to a jarring halt as my father re-entered, dragging me by the arm. The sudden change in the atmosphere was palpable. The string quartet in the corner faltered, their bows hovering awkwardly over their instruments before they stopped playing altogether. 30 pairs of eyes locked onto us. Uncle David lowered his glass of scotch. Aunt Clara leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with the predatory excitement of impending drama. Brenda stood near the grand fireplace, clutching a tissue, playing the role of the devastated victim to absolute perfection. My father guided me to the center of the room, right beneath the largest crystal chandelier. He let go of my arm as if I had burned him, taking a step back to address the entire room. Family. Guests, he began, his voice booming effortlessly across the expansive hall. I apologize for the interruption of our evening. However, there is a matter of grave importance that must be addressed immediately. A matter of betrayal. I stood frozen, the heat of embarrassment crawling up my neck and staining my cheeks red. I looked at my cousins Leo, Sarah, and Beatrice, who were whispering to each other, pointing subtly in my direction. I was entirely alone. As many of you know, the Staffordshire sapphire has been a cherished piece of our family's history, my father continued, pacing slowly like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. It is a symbol of our legacy. Tonight, we discovered that it has been stolen from my private safe. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Aunt Clara placed a dramatic hand over her pearl necklace. And I am deeply ashamed to say, my father turned, pointing a rigid finger directly at me, that the culprit is standing right in front of you. Dad! Stop! I whispered, my voice trembling. Please, do not interrupt me, he barked, turning back to the crowd. She has taken advantage of the privilege and luxury this family has provided her. She has shown a blatant disregard for our rules, for her stepmother, and for the Harrington name. She stole the necklace, intending to sell it to fund her own selfish, rebellious endeavors. That's not true! I shouted, finding a sudden burst of desperate courage. I looked around the room, making eye contact with my uncle. Uncle David, you know I wouldn't do that. It was my mother's necklace. David looked away, awkwardly clearing his throat and inspecting the ice in his glass. No one stepped forward. No one spoke up, as they were all on my father's payroll in one way or another. To defy him was to risk being cut off. Your mother would be disgusted by what you've become, my father said coldly, delivering the final, crushing blow. I felt the air get knocked out of my lungs, and the room began to spin slightly. Because of this unforgivable breach of trust, he announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. She is grounded indefinitely. Her car is confiscated. Her phone, her laptop, and her allowances are immediately terminated. Tomorrow morning, she will be packing her bags. I have already spoken to the headmaster at the St. Jude Academy in Montana. She will remain at the boarding school year-round until she learns the value of discipline and respect. Brenda stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. It's for her own good. We tried our best. You are a monster, I breathed, glaring at Brenda through a blur of tears. Go to your room. Now. Before I call the police and have you arrested for grand larceny, my father ordered, pointing toward the grand staircase. I felt completely defeated, the weight of the injustice threatening to crush me into the marble floor. I turned toward the stairs, the absolute silence of my 30 relatives deafening in my ears. I took one heavy step, then another. Bang. The sound of the massive, solid mahogany front doors swinging open violently echoed through the cavernous foyer, startling everyone in the ballroom. The heavy brass handles crashed against the walls. The crowd turned as one, necks craning to see who dared to interrupt my father's grand display of authority. Standing in the doorway, framed by the cold November night, was an older gentleman. He wore a sharp, classic navy trench coat, holding a worn, leather briefcase in his right hand. The wind howled behind him, blowing a few stray autumn leaves into the immaculate foyer. He took off his fedora, revealing a head of neat, silver hair and a face lined with decades of legal battles and zero tolerance for nonsense. It was Mr. Pendleton. He was the senior managing partner at Pendleton, Hayes and Croft. He had been the primary legal counsel for the Harrington family for over 40 years, handling everything from corporate mergers to private trusts. More importantly, he had been my mother's personal attorney before she died. My father frowned, clearly thrown off balance by the intrusion. Arthur, what on earth are you doing here? It's Saturday night. If this is about the corporate filings, it could have waited until Monday. Mr. Pendleton did not smile or offer a polite greeting. He slowly walked into the ballroom, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble. He stopped directly between my father and the staircase where I stood. This couldn't wait until Monday, he said, his voice carrying a calm, authoritative gravel that immediately commanded the room's attention. He set his briefcase down on a nearby cocktail table, snapping the brass locks open with 2 loud clicks. Arthur, this is a private family matter, Brenda interjected, her voice tight with forced sweetness. We are in the middle of disciplining her. She stole. I know exactly what you are accusing her of, Brenda. Mr. Pendleton cut her off without even looking at her. He pulled a thick stack of documents from his briefcase. He finally turned his gaze to me, offering me the first warm, sympathetic look I had received all evening. I'm afraid she won't be going to her room, he stated firmly, turning back to face my father. And she certainly won't be going to any boarding school in Montana. My father bristled, puffing out his chest. Arthur, you are my lawyer. You do not dictate how I raise my daughter or run my household. Now, I suggest you step aside. Mr. Pendleton pulled a pair of reading glasses from his coat pocket and slipped them onto his face. He looked at my father with a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. Correction, he said, his voice slicing through the silent room like a scalpel. I was your lawyer. As of an hour ago, my firm has officially dropped you as a client. I am here tonight solely in my capacity as the executor of your late wife's estate and as the newly appointed sole legal guardian of her daughter. A collective gasp echoed through the room, and Brenda took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. What are you talking about? My father demanded, his confident facade beginning to crack. I am her father. Biologically, yes, Mr. Pendleton replied, tapping the stack of papers. And by the time I am finished explaining what is in these folders, you are going to wish a missing necklace was the only thing you had to worry about tonight. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sharp, methodical clicking of his gold pen as he unscrewed the cap. He spread the thick, ivory-coloured legal documents across the cocktail table, smoothing the creases with a calm, deliberate motion that only served to amplify the sheer panic radiating from my father. My dad's face had drained of its arrogant flush, replaced by a sickly, pallid grey. This is a profound mistake, my father hissed, keeping his voice low in a desperate attempt to maintain a sliver of dignity in front of the 30 relatives watching his every move. You cannot simply barge into my estate and declare yourself the guardian of my daughter. I am her biological father. I have custodial rights." "You had custodial rights," Mr. Pendleton corrected, not bothering to lower his voice. The veteran attorney wanted every aunt, uncle, and opportunistic cousin in the room to hear the exact terms of their host's impending ruin. Rights that were entirely contingent upon a set of deeply specific, immutable conditions laid out in her mother's final testament. At the mention of my mum, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Standing near the base of the grand staircase, I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my chest. I had always known my mother was a brilliant woman, a strategist who possessed a far keener business mind than my father ever did. But I had never known the depths of her foresight. "She knew exactly who you were," Mr. Pendleton continued, adjusting his reading glasses as he scanned the top document. "She knew that behind the tailored suits and the forced laughter, you were a man driven entirely by ego and optics. She also knew that the moment she passed, you would eventually view your daughter not as a child, but as a liability, a threat to your absolute, unchecked control." Brenda stepped forward, her voice shrill and trembling with indignation. "This is absurd. He is the CEO of Harrington Enterprises. He built this family's wealth from the ground up." Mr. Pendleton stopped reading, slowly lowering the documents and turning his steely gaze toward my stepmother. The look he gave her was one of such profound, glacial contempt that Brenda instinctively took a step backward, her bravado shattering instantly. "Brenda, your ignorance of this family's actual financial architecture is as staggering as your lack of morality," he stated smoothly. "He did not build Harrington Enterprises. He married into it. The capital, the commercial real estate, the liquid assets, the very marble floorboards you are standing on tonight, they all belonged to the generational trust. When she passed, she did not leave the empire to him." The collective gasp from my relatives was highly audible. Aunt Beatrice, who had been sipping her champagne, nearly dropped her crystal flute, her mouth hanging open. Uncle David leaned forward, suddenly intensely interested in the legal mechanics of the brother he had spent his entire adult life leeching off of. "She left it in a blind trust, entirely for her daughter," Mr. Pendleton declared, his voice echoing off the mahogany-panelled walls with absolute authority. "He was merely appointed as a steward, a glorified property manager, permitted to draw a generous salary and utilize the Newport estate, provided he adhered to one singular, non-negotiable stipulation." He picked up a specific page, holding it up so the chandelier light caught the thick, raised notary seal at the bottom. "Clause 4, subsection B," he read aloud, his diction precise and lethal. "Should he attempt to disinherit, legally emancipate, or physically exile his daughter from her primary residence without the unanimous consent of the estate's legal board, he will immediately forfeit his stewardship. All access to the trust's capital will be permanently frozen. His position as CEO will be terminated, and he will be given 48 hours to vacate all properties owned by the trust." My father looked as though he had been struck by a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The absolute, unassailable power he had wielded just 10 minutes prior had evaporated into thin air. He was a king without a kingdom. "You stood in this room, Mr. Pendleton said, his tone dropping to a dangerous, icy register, in front of 30 witnesses, and declared that you were confiscating her assets, freezing her allowances, and banishing her to a disciplinary boarding school in Montana indefinitely. You executed the exact trigger clause her mother predicted you would. You handed me the legal authority to destroy you, and I am here to collect." I was disciplining a thief!" my father suddenly shouted, his panic morphing into a wild, cornered desperation. He pointed a trembling, desperate finger at me. "She stole the Staffordshire sapphire. She broke the law. The board will never uphold a trust for a convicted criminal." This was the lifeline Brenda desperately needed, and she quickly recovered her theatrical poise, nodding vigorously, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Exactly, Arthur. You are protecting a delinquent. The necklace is gone. I checked the master safe myself. She is the only one who was in that wing of the house." My relatives began to mutter amongst themselves again. the pendulum of their fickle loyalty swinging wildly. The accusation of theft was still a massive, undeniable stain on the evening. Even if my father was deposed, a thief could not run an empire. Mr. Pendleton merely sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion mixed with grim satisfaction. He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a small, unassuming manila envelope. "I was hoping we could handle the matter of the trust with some semblance of quiet dignity," he murmured, though his eyes gleamed with the promise of utter destruction. "But since you insist on dying on this particular hill, Brenda, let us address the mystery of the missing sapphire." "The Staffordshire sapphire," he began, pacing slowly toward the center of the room, forcing my father and Brenda to turn and face him, "is a remarkably recognizable piece of high jewelry, a 40-carat unheated Ceylon sapphire, surrounded by flawless, brilliant-cut diamonds. It is not the sort of item one simply pawns at a local strip mall. It requires a specialized, highly discreet buyer." I watched, my heart pounding against my ribs. I didn't dare move, completely mesmerized by the absolute dismantling of the two people who had made my life a living hell for the past 3 years. "Earlier this week," Mr. Pendleton continued, tapping the manila envelope against his palm, "a private, highly exclusive jewelry broker in Manhattan contacted my firm. As the executor of the estate, my name is firmly attached to all her major insured assets on the international registry. The broker called to verify the provenance of the Staffordshire sapphire, as he had just been offered the piece for a fraction of its market value." My father frowned, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He turned to look at me, then back to the lawyer. "She went to Manhattan? She hasn't left Rhode Island." "No, she hasn't," Mr. Pendleton agreed softly. "But someone else took a sudden, unchaperoned trip to the city last Tuesday. Someone who, according to the private investigators my firm retains, has been making very frequent, very quiet trips to an underground baccarat table in Atlantic City over the last 8 months." The color rapidly drained from Brenda's face, and the manufactured panic she had displayed earlier was entirely gone, replaced by genuine, visceral terror. Her manicured hands began to shake so violently that she had to clutch her dress to steady them. "Brenda?" my father whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the incoming revelation. He turned to his wife, his eyes wide with a horrified realization. "What is he talking about? He's lying!" Brenda shrieked, her voice pitching into an ugly, hysterical octave. "He's making it up to protect her! I didn't go to Manhattan! I don't gamble! He's trying to frame me." Mr. Pendleton didn't bother to argue. He simply opened the manila envelope and pulled out 2 items. The first was a crisp, high-resolution photograph printed on glossy paper, and the second was a heavy, midnight blue velvet box. He tossed the photograph onto the cocktail table, and it landed right side up, perfectly visible to my father, Uncle David, and Aunt Beatrice, who had practically sprinted across the room, shedding her dignity to get a closer look. It was a security camera still, completely undeniable and crystal clear. It showed Brenda sitting in the lavish private office of the Manhattan broker, her signature designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, with the Staffordshire sapphire laid out on the leather desk blotter between them. "A staggering debt of $3.2 million, Mr. Pendleton announced to the silent, captive audience, effectively burning Brenda's reputation to ash. Racked up over 18 months of reckless, high-stakes gambling, the private syndicate holding the debt was losing patience. They threatened to make the debts public, which would have ruined your precious social standing, Brenda. So, you went into the master safe to which you, as his wife, had the combination, and you stole the one item you knew could cover the margin call. You then framed your stepdaughter to cover your tracks." Brenda let out a choked, pathetic sob, covering her face with her hands. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto a nearby velvet armchair, utterly defeated and ruined. My father stared at the photograph, his breathing shallow and rapid. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down upon him with the force of an avalanche. His wife was a thief and a compulsive gambler, and he had publicly humiliated and disinherited his innocent daughter over a crime she didn't commit. And in doing so, he had triggered the exact legal mechanism that stripped him of his entire fortune. He had nothing left. The karmic justice was swift, brutal, and absolute. Mr. Pendleton opened the velvet box, and nestled inside, gleaming intensely under the grand chandelier light, was the breathtaking Staffordshire sapphire. He had clearly used estate funds to intercept the sale and bring it home. He walked past the broken shell of a man that was my father and approached me. "Your mother wanted you to have this on your 18th birthday," he said gently, his tone softening for the first time all evening as he looked at me. He held the open box out to me, but given the circumstances, I believe she would want you to wear it tonight, as a reminder of exactly who you are and what you own. I reached out with trembling fingers, tracing the cool, smooth surface of the massive gemstone. Tears streamed down my cheeks, but they were no longer tears of humiliation or despair. They were tears of profound relief, closure, and overwhelming vindication. I looked up at Mr. Pendleton, expressing my silent gratitude. And then I looked over his shoulder at the room full of relatives, the 30 people who had stared at me with judgment, glee, and disdain just 20 minutes ago were now looking at me with an entirely different emotion, sheer, unadulterated fear. They realized, simultaneously, that the quiet, bullied teenager they had ignored and isolated was now the sole, uncontested proprietor of the Harrington fortune. I held their monthly allowances, their lavish trust funds, and their entire social survival in the palm of my hand. My father took a shaky step forward, raising a trembling hand in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Sweetheart, please, you have to know I was deceived by her. I didn't know about the gambling. We can fix this. We are family. I'm your father." I slowly lifted the sapphire necklace from its velvet casing and clasped it securely around my own neck. The heavy, cool weight of the diamonds settled against my collarbone, feeling less like jewelry and more like an impenetrable suit of armor. I stood taller, squaring my shoulders as I looked the man who had tormented me dead in the eye. The power dynamic in the grand ballroom had entirely inverted, and the status reversal was complete. "You made your choice," I said, my voice clear, steady, and devoid of any familial affection. I didn't call him Dad, because the man who had dragged me in front of a crowd to execute my character was dead to me. "You have 48 hours to pack your things and leave my house." The sheer audacity of his plea hung heavily in the stifling air of the Newport Estate ballroom. For a man who had spent the better part of a decade cultivating an aura of absolute invincibility, begging his 17-year-old daughter for mercy was a spectacular, humiliating fall from grace. I did not blink. I felt the undeniable presence of the Staffordshire sapphire resting against my collarbone. It was cold, grounding, and a fierce, tangible reminder of my mother's enduring protection. 48 hours, I repeated, my voice echoing with a chilling calmness that sent shivers down the spines of the remaining onlookers. "And do not think you can strip this house of its valuables on your way out. Mr. Pendleton has already instructed the estate security team to monitor your packing. You will leave with the clothes you purchased with your own personal, non-trust accounts, and absolutely nothing more." He opened his mouth to argue, but the words withered in his throat. He looked at the lawyer, who simply tapped the crystal face of his vintage Patek Philippe watch. The countdown had officially begun. Brenda, still crumpled on the velvet armchair, let out a wretched, high-pitched wail. "My debts! The syndicate from the Borgata Hotel Casino in Atlantic City, they know where we live. If we don't have the necklace, they are going to come after us. You have to fix this." Turning his back on his disgraced wife, my father looked at his brother, David, who was currently attempting to edge his way toward the ballroom's exit unnoticed. David! Wait, you have the guest house in the Hamptons. We can stay there while I contact the lawyers at JP Morgan Chase to contest this ridiculous trust execution." David froze, his face flushing a deep, embarrassing crimson as he looked at me, then at my father, rapidly calculating the odds of his own financial survival. "Actually, the Hamptons property is currently..." undergoing severe renovations. Black mold, terrible situation, completely uninhabitable. And to be frank, I cannot be associated with this kind of scandal right now. My reputation in the firm. He trailed off, avoiding his brother's desperate gaze before hurrying out the grand double doors. One by one, the 30 relatives who had gathered to witness my destruction began to scatter like roaches exposed to the light. Aunt Beatrice suddenly remembered an early morning flight to Paris she needed to pack for. Cousin Leo murmured something incoherent about leaving his oven on. The sheer hypocrisy of their hasty retreats was a masterclass in the fickle nature of wealth-adjacent loyalty. Having arrived to feast on the weak, they fled the ecosystem entirely upon realizing the prey was actually the apex predator. Within 10 minutes, the grand ballroom was entirely empty, save for me, Mr. Pendleton, and the two broken figures near the dying embers of the fireplace. The lawyer gestured to two towering estate security guards who had silently entered the room during the commotion. "Escort them to the master suite," he ordered cleanly. "Provide them with standard luggage boxes. Ensure they do not access the master safe, the art gallery, or the private garage. Their access to the Aston Martin and the Range Rover has been permanently revoked." As the guards hauled them away, their protests echoing hollowly down the grand marble corridor, I finally allowed myself to take a deep, shuddering breath. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the ordeal began to ebb, leaving behind a profound sense of physical exhaustion, but also an overwhelming, brilliant clarity. "You handled yourself incredibly well tonight," Mr. Pendleton said softly, stepping up beside me. He closed his leather briefcase, the sharp snaps sounding like the final gavel strike of a courtroom trial. "Your mother would be immensely proud of the woman you have become. She always knew you possessed the steel required to manage the empire. Did she really know he would do this?" I asked, staring at the empty space where my father had just stood. "Did she know he would try to throw me away? Over a lie?" He sighed, a heavy, sorrowful sound that carried the weight of his long career. She was a realist. She observed how he operated long before she grew ill. She knew that power, unearned and unchecked, corrupts absolutely. She structured the trust to give him enough rope to either pull himself up or hang himself. He predictably chose the latter. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of frantic, humiliating activity for the former rulers of the Newport estate. True to Mr. Pendleton's meticulous planning, the transition of power was mercilessly efficient. My father's corporate access at Harrington Enterprises was digitally severed before the sun even rose on Sunday. When he attempted to contact his allies on the board of directors, his calls went straight to voicemail. The business world, much like his cowardly family, had immediately smelled the blood in the water and distanced themselves from the sinking ship. Brenda's departure was even more chaotic. Panicked by the looming threat of the Atlantic City Syndicate, she attempted to smuggle out several pieces of high-end jewelry hidden inside the lining of a designer coat. The estate security, well versed in her deceitful tactics, intercepted the items immediately. She left the property sobbing uncontrollably, clutching a single, battered canvas duffel bag, and climbing into the back of a standard yellow taxi my father had been forced to order from a prepaid burner phone. Monday morning arrived crisp and bright, washing the sprawling Rhode Island estate in a brilliant golden light. The mansion felt entirely different. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere of his tyranny and Brenda's toxic vanity had been completely scrubbed away. The house was quiet, breathing easily for the first time in 3 years. I sat at the head of the massive, mahogany dining table, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea. Mr. Pendleton sat to my right, a fresh stack of financial dossiers neatly organized before him as the legal transition was complete. At 17, I was the sole, uncontested steward of a multi-billion-dollar empire, overseen by him until my 18th birthday. "We have some pressing matters to attend to," he noted, opening the first folder. "The family stipends." He established monthly allowances for nearly 24 relatives, including your Uncle David and Aunt Beatrice, drawn directly from the corporate dividends. I set my teacup down gently on the saucer, remembering the silence of those relatives. I remembered the smirks on their faces as my father publicly humiliated me, and the frantic speed at which they abandoned him when the tables turned. "Cancel all of them," I instructed smoothly, my voice devoid of malice but filled with absolute authority. "Every single one. If Uncle David requires capital for his renovations, he can secure a bank loan like a normal citizen. Harrington Enterprises is no longer a charity for cowards." His lips twitched upward into a rare, genuine smile, and he took his gold pen and drew a thick, decisive line through the list of names. "Consider it done. It seems the Harrington Empire is finally in capable hands." 2 months later, a freezing rain washed over the city of Providence. I sat in the back of my chauffeur-driven Maybach, parked discreetly across the street from a rundown, budget motel. Mr. Pendleton sat beside me, handing me a tablet displaying the latest quarterly profits. "He has been attempting to secure employment," he noted quietly, glancing out the window. However, the news of his expulsion from the trust, coupled with Brenda's substantial, unpaid gambling debts, has made him entirely radioactive in the corporate sector. He is currently working as a mid-level shift supervisor at a regional logistics warehouse. I looked through the tinted glass and saw my father walking out of the motel office through the pouring rain, his shoulders hunched against the biting cold. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting nylon raincoat that was a far cry from his custom-tailored suits. He looked exhausted, defeated, and entirely ordinary, while Brenda was nowhere to be seen. Having reportedly fled state lines weeks ago to avoid the collectors tracking her every move, watching him trudge through the deep puddles, I felt no pity. Nor did I feel the burning anger that had consumed me for years. I felt nothing at all. He was simply a stranger who had gambled his kingdom on a cruel lie and lost everything. "Drive," I told my chauffeur softly. The heavy luxury vehicle pulled away from the curb, its tires gliding smoothly over the wet asphalt, leaving the ghosts of my past behind in the rain. I touched the cool sapphire resting against my chest. I had survived the gilded cage. I had weathered the storm of betrayal and emerged not as a victim, but as a queen. The era of his hollow reign was over forever, and the dawn of the true heir had finally arrived.